Go ahead and grab your seats. We'll get started now. Looks like everybody has their slice of pizza. So I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute here at WSU, and I'm happy to welcome you out to our ongoing series on the politics of climate change. And today we're very fortunate to have with us one of WSU's own, Anne Pisor. And she's going to be talking about the culture of climate adaptation today. So Anne is an associate professor of anthropology and the director of the Human Sociality Lab here at WSU. Her research focuses on human social life, climate adaptation, and natural resource management. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, among many other organizations, and her work has appeared in journals such as Nature, Climate Change, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Outside of her academic work, Anne is also the founder and CEO of a startup. Is it Climto?
Climb2.
Climb2, okay. Climb2, which is an organization that focuses on supporting and tracking climate resilience. So, and if you want to know more about Anne, hot off the press, today's Evergreen, a big feature article about her work is there, so you can read more about her after you leave here. Join me now in welcoming Anne Pisor.
Hi everyone, thanks for making it out today. So I'm happy to be here to talk to you a little bit about the culture of climate change adaptation. So I don't have to tell y'all that the impacts of climate change just keep coming. Here we have images from across Washington State. First disclaimer, the person in the car over here was just fine, just looks intense. But what we're looking at here are sea level rise and storm surge. We're looking at heat domes and smoke days in Spokane, and we're looking at landslides. And these impacts are affecting all of us in the state. Now, if we zoom out and think about the whole globe, we can think about new initiatives from the government of the United States and from the United Nations, and think about what the UN Secretary General said last year. We need progress in adaptation in order to reinforce our resilience to climate change. Important. But the question is, how do we make progress on that? Where do we start? So in an influential review from Nature Climate Change a couple years ago, Barang, Ford, and al. said, first of all, we have stark inadequacy of current methods and evidence to assess the effectiveness of responses in terms of risk reduction, part one. Part two, we need data on the durability of documented adaptation responses, how long it takes for benefits to accrue, and for whom they accrue. So thinking about the time scale of adaptation and also equity issues. Now, this is important, right? We need those data, and we need to work on those methods and that evidence base, but how do we begin? Where do we begin to actually make this change, to actually get the evidence we need to make informed policy about climate change adaptation? So that's what I'll be talking a bit about today, just giving some ideas. Of course, there's only so much we can do in 30 minutes. But today we'll talk about how past and contemporary data tell us a bit about what solutions have been adapted in the past. We'll talk about how social network data suggests what systems tend to work and where to intervene. And finally, we'll talk a bit about what we know and how to be systematic about studying climate change as we support communities. So let's start with this first part of the Barang, Ford et al. Quote. The effectiveness of responses in terms of risk reduction. How do we measure that? The first thing we need to do is we need to establish what adaptation is. If you're in the climate science literature, you probably know this. Folks are really vague about what they mean by adaptation. So I'm pulling from my own definition, a little bias here, but if you look across the way we use the term adaptation in social sciences, biological sciences, in policy, something that unites it is to say change in response to or anticipation of something, in this case climate change, to reduce risk. So there's lots of different levels at which we can think about adaptation. We can think about adaptation in infrastructure for the entire United States. We can think about adaptation of the Pullman campus, for example, in terms of heating in the winter or cooling in the summer. But today we're going to focus on individual level adaptation. How do folks in households or just making individual decisions deal with climate impacts? So if we take the long view and the broad view of human history, there's a lot of common themes that emerge in terms of how humans, past and present, have managed risk. I'm highlighting just a few of these here. They're in an upcoming article that you'll actually get a link to here at the end of the talk, so stay tuned for QR codes. But a few things to highlight. First thing, savings. Whether you're saving food or saving money, that's been a really important thing for managing risk for people past and present. Mobility has been key, and migration is a theme this semester here in these lunchtime talks. Income diversification, whether it's having multiple jobs, planting multiple crops, and risk pooling, a really key one that we work on in my lab here at the Human Sociality Lab, thinking about how people put resources together and then actually redistribute them in times of need. So something important to keep in mind here is that adaptations are just candidate adaptations until they prove they're effective. We don't know that something reduces risk until we've seen that it reduces risk. So let's come back to that adaptation, right? What do we mean by adaptation? What does it mean to be effective, and who gets to decide what counts at reducing risk? So I'm going to go through 3 different definitions that colleagues of mine and others in the literature and in policy have used in terms of what adaptation means when we talk about reducing risk. So the first thing we can do, and I've used this as a shorthand before, is we can think about what spreads and what sticks. So if something reduces risk, we assume that people will keep using it, right? It's working for them, they'll keep using it. The diffusion of innovation literature is all about that, and it persists across time. Now, the assumption here, big asterisk at the bottom, is that maladaptive practices will disappear over time. And we know from, for example, misinformation, that things can be really slow to go away, even if they're not working well. So will they go away, and at what cost in the meantime while they're still being practiced? Adaptation, if it's effective, may also be something that limits the intensity, frequency, or scope of negative impacts. So if Pullman is hit by a climate impact, say a big flood, is Colfax hit by a climate impact, or is Moscow hit? Trying to actually keep that constraint of geographical scope small might be something we strive for with adaptation. And finally, we can actually think about what stakeholders say work for them. When we talk to communities on the front lines, what do they say works for them in terms of reducing risk and being effective at doing that? Now, here's the thing to keep in mind too, another big caveat. First of all, what works for individuals may not work well for communities. Turning up the AC to stay cool on a hot air day in Spokane does increase emissions, right? So there's these trade-offs in terms of these different levels. So lots of things to keep in mind here with a few important caveats to go with. Now, I'm an anthropologist, and I can't give a talk without talking about culture. So here it is, right? And it's in the title. Climate change adaptation is cultural. Now, if you haven't thought about culture in this way before, let me define it for you. So culture, most basically, is information that are in brains that we use to adapt, right? Or we use to create things. We use to create material culture or buildings or infrastructure. It moves from brain to brain. So let me give you an example of this. This is again coming from the Brangford paper, which I actually really like, even though I use it here as a few counterexamples. And this basically shows a diagram of what kinds of adaptation people are using across different continents of the globe. So where you see lines going further out towards those continents, I'll use my pointer here, that means they're using more of it, right? So a lot of behavioral and cultural adaptation in Africa, for example. Y'all can't see that, I'll just point. There we go. Now, here's the thing. Anthropologist looks at this paper and says, actually, this is really interesting. When folks are talking about nature-based adaptations in the policy literature, they're talking about things like mulching or changing the way that folks cultivate. That's culture, right? Those ideas are moving from brain to brain between farmers. When we talk about infrastructure, oftentimes we're talking about culture, ideas about how to construct seawalls, for example. And when we're talking about, for example, having these more institutional changes, social safety nets, the ideas that different programs are using around the globe for how to buffer risk move from nonprofit to nonprofit, from NGO to NGO. So there's a lot of cultural transmission happening, even in the climate change adaptation space. So first premise, climate change adaptation is cultural, moves from brain to brain. It's also often grassroots. So when we look at the literature, we often find that some of the most effective adaptation is coming from communities, things that already work for them. May not be what policymakers are talking about, but communities often have been using this for a very long time, often since time immemorial. The other thing about climate change adaptation is it evolves. Okay, so I'm an evolutionary anthropologist as well as a cultural anthropologist. What I mean by this is that there's innovation in the climate change space. People come up with new ideas. Those ideas change across time and they get transmitted. They can also get retained if they work well. People keep doing stuff if it works well for them. All of these ideas are similar to ideas from biology, and so when you hear me talk about innovation and transmission today, you'll know that you can use those similar concepts to think about what persists, what moves, etc. So again, coming back to these quotes from the Barang-Ford paper, highlighting this, the stark inadequacy of current evidence base. How do we address that evidence, and what do we actually already know if we look at what people have been doing? So data that do already exist from sources like archaeological data, ethnographic data, social science data, suggests that locally led solutions, things emerging from communities, can be effective, retained, and transmitted. So let me give you an example. This is coming from a paper with my collaborators, Chris Smith, who's here in the audience today, and Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder, focusing on the island of Pemba off of Tanzania. Now, some of you may be familiar with carbon payment schemes, read of the room, right? So basically, if folks preserve forest on Pemba, they then get payments for doing so, right? These are carbon offsets. And because of this scheme locally, there was this new requirement for an institution called a Community Forest Management Agreement. So what CFMAs do is they basically say, okay, everyone has to kind of come together. Actually, these are COFMAs, pardon me. What COFMAs say is everyone has to basically come together and preserve forests at the community level, right? We're going to set this off and we're not going to log. Now here's the first thing. Communities said, hey, people from the next community over are stealing lumber from us, right? We don't like that. So let's actually band together between communities to actually create this overarching organization that keeps other people out from taking our lumber. So we see this innovation in terms of self-organization into multi-community conservation committees. Now, this stealing between communities is something called leakage. And those communities with the most effective management institutions were able to reduce leakage. So imagine here we have communities P and Q with their forests, and each has an institution, a way of managing their forests, Big P and Big Q. Now, what's doing well is Big P's institution. No one from Q is coming to take their trees. But on the other hand, in Q, right, they're getting lots of folks from P coming over and taking their trees. So how do you deal with this? What we often see is that community Q will actually adopt the institution of community P and say, that over there is working well, we want to do that. So the data that do exist suggests that locally led solutions are very effective, and a lot of these solutions involve things like risk pooling, savings, income diversification. Sometimes the very solutions we come up with when we are doing policy work or doing research as scientists, that they're already there, right? Communities are already using them. And if we have those conversations with communities, we often discover that that's the case. The question then becomes, of course, what innovations get transmitted under what conditions, right? This is something I like to think about. So we know communities are using different solutions, but we don't know what they're solutions to, right? If we're not systematically understanding, for example, the climate impacts locally, we don't know what about climate variability, for example, is leading folks to adopt certain adaptations. So in a paper that was just accepted with another WSU collaborator, Deepti Singh, we actually outline how you can use climate data to try to understand which adaptations work where. So the first thing we're doing here is we're looking at precipitation data from 1990 to 2010 from Burkina Faso, just from one single province. And we're looking at variability in that precipitation. So if y'all look at that, there's a fair amount of variability there, right? You can also see trends across years, up and down. But that variability, if we really break it apart, we can also see important features. First of all, sometimes there's a lot of rainfall. Those D's down there, that's duration. So you can have a 3-month-long heavy rainfall period that can really impact agriculture, for example. You can also see changes in autocorrelation, how much events are clustered in space or time. And you can see changes in frequency. Over a year, for example, how many big rain events are there? What we can then do is look at data on adaptation. So I want to look at a risk pooling example here. This is from remittance data. Remittances are where you send money between countries. And if you didn't know, a huge amount of money flows out of the US into other countries every year through remittance networks. So we see money going to places like Mexico, China, the Philippines, etc. And we can ask the question, when should we see remittances come more into play when it comes to climate variability? When are people using this strategy? These are just some first principles predictions that we're going to evaluate in future papers, but what you might predict is that when an event is really bad, you get more remittances. When you have a clustering of events where you get hit again and again and again, folks are more likely to need to use money-based pooling to actually make ends meet. And when events are very frequent, again, same intuition. You get hit a lot, you actually need to use these networks. So really, this paper suggests that fine-grained longitudinal data can help us study what is adaptive and under what conditions, meeting the request of this quote that we have data on the effectiveness of responses in terms of risk reduction and what they are responses to. So just an example of what this looks like visually, a lot going on here, but we're looking at precipitation data across different quadrants in Burkina Faso with overlaid pie charts of how many folks are using remittances. Very descriptive. Now's the time to get systematic. Stay tuned for another paper on that. Okay. So, what do we know from social networks? Humans are so social, right? I work at the Human Sociality Lab. That's the lab I direct. What do we know from human social networks about what systems tend to work where and where we should intervene in terms of encouraging adaptation in social networks? So for those of you who aren't familiar with social network analysis, here's an example of what a social network might look like, right? You have a bunch of different people who are connected by friendships, by family relationships, even by work relationships, and those relationships can come of lots of different forms. It can be advice giving, they can be sharing resources, they can be who you spend the holidays with every year, right? Now, we can ask, how do innovations emerge on social networks? How are people coming up with new ideas for climate change adaptation? What are the predictors of when that happens? So what we find in the literature is that innovations can emerge more easily if someone has lots of ties. The more people you know, the more information's flowing, and the more you can actually get in information you can then innovate on and put back out into the world. Access to information, as I mentioned there, is super key, right? Having folks who are actually talking about climate change adaptation enables you to remix it. And support to hedge against the risk of failure cannot be understated. If you're experimenting with climate change adaptation, sometimes things are not going to work out. They're not going to manage risk. And we don't have a lot of time to pivot, right, before things start to get even worse than they are today. So having a network that actually can support you against risk, say if you decide to change your crops as a farmer and it doesn't work out that year, having that support can be really key to innovation, giving folks the actual ability to innovate instead of having constraints that keep them from doing so. So how do innovations spread across social networks? I'm going to move here from looking at the kind of nice social network with all the faces to an actual graph. This is what they look like. Same thing, I'll just do that back and forth once more here, okay? Now we're going to look at a graph and how people are, say, clustered into different subpopulations or subgroups of, say, the United States or even of Washington State based on, say, who they're talking to when it comes to climate adaptation. So when networks have subpopulations like this, maybe structured by political affiliation or structured by what industry they're working in, we should expect innovations to spread more easily when there's less aversion to outgroup ideas. No surprise in this room to the political scientists, right? Second thing, dense ties locally can actually be challenging when it comes to climate impacts. So if we look at that big blue cluster there of folks kind of all together in the same network, if they're all together in the same space or the same industry, if that industry gets impacted, if we have a really bad year for wheat, if prices drop, what happens is everyone is on the same boat, right? Those climate impacts actually get amplified. So having dense ties like this can be problematic for dealing with climate. On the other hand, ties that go between subpopulations can be surprisingly useful. For those of you familiar with the sociological literature, this is often called the strength of weak ties, right? So when you have connections between these two subpopulations, not only can they buffer climate impacts when you have these big correlated risks, they also facilitate the spread of innovation between subpopulations. And that can be really key because what's importantly happening in these smaller subgroups who are often kind of off by themselves geographically or in terms of interactions, say, in certain industries, is that they're often innovating the most and have the most ideas to share. So in short, we can't understand the evolution, again here I mean innovation, transmission, the persistence of ideas, to climate change adaptation without an eye to network structure. Climate variability impacts the way people manage risk. That in turn alters network structure, who you're connected to, how you're actually risk pooling, for example, to make things work. That in turn affects transmission, who you're talking to as you're accessing those resources, which in turn changes risk management strategies. So there's a feedback there between how people are coping and what ideas they're sharing that we really need to pay attention to. So where do we begin, right? We have some data, we have some understanding, good news, right? We're not starting from scratch. How do we draw on what we know, and how do we be systematic about studying climate change adaptation while also supporting communities at the same time? I'm going to flash this really quick. I'll try to pause here because you do need the QR codes. I have 2 recent special issues I organized on this very topic, pulling together data from across the globe on how people are adapting to climate change. So a very anthropology-focused issue in the American Journal of Human Biology, focused on what anthropologists know about this. And then recently, about a month ago, Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, we have a new issue incorporating stuff from economics, political science, archaeology, etc., all together in one spot. So here's the thing about adaptation. As one of my colleagues said once, nobody's written the book on adaptation. We're all trying things. And that's important, right? It means we have to share the ideas that we're coming up with, and we need to study adaptation as it evolves. What's working under what climate conditions? What's working for communities on the front lines? What spreads between people? What captures their imaginations? What works given their own incomes and well-being? What persists, and what reduces risk? So how do we build on what we know and be systematic about it? The first step I alluded to earlier in today's talk, that's being explicit about what counts as adaptation. So I identified 3 different ways we can define effectiveness in terms of adaptation earlier. I want to just highlight 2 that I think are the most important here. Rather than what we've been doing, looking at just what persists and spreads, right, which can basically tell us sometimes about maladaptation, things that aren't working but are still persisting, we can instead look at what limits the intensity, frequency, or scope of negative impacts, and we can ask stakeholders what works for them. Starting that conversation and having that humility can be a big step. We also need fine-grained longitudinal data. That is, if I didn't define it before, longitudinal just means across time, across space. Fine-grained means really just asking individuals what works for them. We need to know that, and we need to know under what conditions it works, right? So that's the paper I mentioned earlier, looking at climate conditions and adaptation. Now, coming back to the Ford et al. Paper, we need data on the durability of documented adaptation responses, how long it takes for their benefits to accrue and to whom they accrue. So let's talk about one important way in which we can get this information. And to do that, I want to talk about a paper in the PhilTrans special issue by a collaborator of mine, Tim Waring. So what Tim and his co-authors did is they collected data across counties in the United States about what people were planting, what crops farmers were using. And what they did is they looked at the evapotranspiration of the soil and the climatic water deficit, so 2 different measures of soil moisture. And they said, okay, do the crops that folks are planting locally match what we're seeing in terms of soil moisture? And what you're seeing here is kind of a big descriptive pattern here, but the answer is ever so slightly yes, right? They see a little bit of a trend here in terms of adoption of new crops that meet moisture conditions for farmers. So that's good news. The problem here, right, is we still need that longitudinal data. So this is just one time point in their study. We're just looking at one graph here. What does this look like going forward? What sticks? What reduces risk? Will crop choice continue to change over time? And knowing that can help us study spread and persistence in something that is effective, putting all of these points together. Something else that can't be underscored enough here is that we need to support communities as they pivot. So sometimes it can be tempting as a scientist to say, we're going to be objective here. We're just going to see what works. I don't think that's an ethical stance, right? I think we actually have to be ready to support communities as they pivot, to give them the tools to innovate and generate ideas. We know that community-led adaptation works well, but to support communities as they need it when time to pivot comes, because it will come, right? So this is a graphic from my 2022 Nature Climate Change paper, and here's what I want to highlight. So first, we have two communities at the top who are sharing information with each other. That's that innovation line you see up there at the top, right? And they're sharing information about what works. So we can think about that. How do we actually support communities sharing information? How do we foster those existing connections or build them when they're not there? They may already be providing risk pooling for one another too, right? Dealing with crop shortfalls, dealing with years where they don't have enough water. But here's the role for development actors down at the bottom: governments, NGOs, right? Policymakers. Providing insurance to these communities to help them, right? We can think about loss and damage, for example, if you've been following along with COP27 and COP28. But I want you to notice the thickness of those arrows down there at the bottom, those innovation arrows. We can learn from communities. We need to learn with communities, not just from them as objects of study. And we need to avoid putting our ideas on communities and swamping them. That's something we learn from the social network research, is that if we bring ideas in and we push really hard, some of that existing indigenous, traditional, local knowledge can be lost. And that can be really helpful for adapting to climate change. So remember the small arrow there at the bottom. A few ideas in, but learning from and with communities is really important. So putting this all together, how do we build on what we already know about climate change adaptation and be systematic about the way we study what works, what's effective, where, and for whom? We need to be explicit about what counts as adaptation, use fine-grained longitudinal data that can help us understand what's adaptive under what conditions. We can then use longitudinal data to also study spread and persistence, keeping that piece in there. And finally, we need to support communities as they innovate and pivot. So, the impacts of climate change just keep coming, and we need progress in adaptation in order to reinforce our resilience to climate change. Where do we begin? That was the question of today's lecture. Here are the three main take-home messages. First, past and contemporary data tell us what solutions have been adaptive. Data that do exist suggests that grassroots solutions are often effective, retained, and transmitted by communities. We can figure out ways to actually support communities as they innovate and share what works for them. We can examine associations between adaptations and characteristics of climate variability to understand what works where. If we are bringing ideas to communities, they should be informed ideas that will work given future climate projections. Social network data suggest what systems tend to work and where to intervene in social networks to encourage innovation and spread of ideas. Peripheries, right, these smaller subgroups on the edge of these larger populations can be important sources of innovation. Oftentimes these are folks who are rural, who are indigenous, who are on the front lines of climate adaptation, and actually preserving the ability for these folks to innovate and supporting those innovations through funding can be really important, lest we swamp those ideas. And we can't understand the evolution, that is the innovation, transmission, persistence, and modification of ideas when it comes to climate change adaptation without an eye to network structure and how that changes across time. Finally, of course, to draw on what we know and be systematic about studying climate change adaptation while also supporting communities, we need to get that longitudinal network structured data and involve communities in all stages of the process, right, doing community engaged work as we do this. And finally, if we are supporting community-led adaptation, we need to be ready with resources to buffer against the downsides of a pivot. Managing risk is exactly what adaptation is all about, and it is key as we go forward into the 21st century and continue to face climate impacts. So being ready to support communities as they pivot, as they respond, is so key. So with that, I want to thank my collaborators, my funders. I want to thank you for your time. And I want to just leave you with some links to pre-printed papers, my lab down here, the Human Sociality Lab at WSU, and you can also find us on social media. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, we have about about 30 minutes for some Q&A. So
I'm going to take a seat, if that's okay with everybody.
maybe I'll start off.
Oh, sure. I have one. Ariane, and then you, if you'd like. Yeah, go for it.
You want
Ariane,
me to go
please.
first? Or?
I saw your hand first.
Oh, okay, that's fair enough.
All right, go for
So
it.
I was wondering if you could give us an example of maybe your favorite or some example of a favorite climate adaptive strategy that came up from like sort of a grassroots effort.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of these that are happening locally with tribes, and those are my favorite. So recently I was talking to Coeur d'Alene tribe, for example, and they are really putting out a climate initiative and working on climate adaptation and climate preparedness. And so I've been really interested to hear what folks are already up to in terms of, say, managing trees, kind of speaking to your work. And that's something, I think you also work with Coeur d'Alene too sometimes, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. So those kinds of efforts are my favorite because they're local, because I can see them, and because it actually takes advantage of, for example, traditional ecological and indigenous ecological knowledge and builds off of that. Does that provide an example to you?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, so, okay, being a political scientist, I'm curious about the role of governments and politics. And you seem to suggest one major role for governments is insurance, provide insurance for communities undergoing adaptation. But I wonder if it's also the case that providing insurance really prevents adaptation from happening. And so I'm thinking right now about, for instance, flood insurance in places like Florida, right, and the South, or fire insurance in California. We know there needs to be adaptation in those communities. They need to move those homes into different places. And we're preventing that by providing cheap insurance, subsidizing insurance, right?
Yeah. So I like to kind of give the big rallying talk, and then during the Q&A go, okay, what are the caveats here? So one of the caveats right off the bat is I was talking to someone in the insurance industry and came to realize, I mean, it was staring me in the face, but I hadn't really heard it, was that there's not a lot of incentive in the insurance industry to actually promote adaptation, because that's where the money comes from, right? If people aren't prepared for climate impacts, that means that when they get hit, they will put in a claim, right? And insurance will pay out, but people will also buy more insurance to go with. So it kind of changes the incentive structure for insurance companies. When it comes to government, it's really interesting, and it sounds like you're really familiar with this. For those of you who aren't, oftentimes you can have social safety nets that are government provided or provided by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that can crowd out local social safety nets. So once they're in place, existing ones that have been in communities for a while can actually get displaced by government insurance. So I think, I mean, the answer, of course, it's such an anthropology thing to say, is it's complicated, right? And I think it's complicated partially because we can see, for example, microinsurance working so well for farmers who are facing climate impacts. And that's often provided by international NGOs, but at the same time it does undercut local social safety nets. And we can see that insurance enables people to keep living in highly impacted places, and insurers don't necessarily want to stop the impacts. They're paying out, but they're also getting money in. So that also changes the incentive structure. So I think, of course, changing incentives is the number one thing we can do. How we do that is a whole nother kettle of fish. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Just by making it more complicated? Yeah, go for it.
So, as an earth scientist, in my reading, to the extent I do this, I tend to focus on mitigation, and I see mitigation and I see adaptation, and I think I have thought of them perhaps ignorantly as separate areas of endeavor. But as I hear you talk, it seems to me like mitigation might be one of the most adaptive things we can do. Is that reasonable? Do you think of it that way?
It's an interesting question. I too have come to realize that you can't separate a lot of times mitigation from adaptation, because the thing is they can actually be working towards the same goal. You can be reducing your emissions at the same time you're actually increasing your resilience. Are they working towards the same goal, and which one should come first? It's been interesting because policy-wise we've really been prioritizing mitigation for a long time, and you can see this big shift now in policy towards adaptation. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that you can actually have them together. Is mitigating the ultimate adaptation? Yeah, because I think it'll reduce risk. The question, of course, is how fast can we rebound from our current emissions levels to lower emissions levels and have some of these big climate variability impacts reduce?
I was just going to say, it seems like the time scale of your concern, the way you set up the problem in terms of time, might affect how you think about this to a substantial extent.
Yeah, with adaptation, I think what it does is it, in some ways, for better or worse, forces us to think almost immediately.
Yeah.
Whereas mitigation, we have slightly longer time horizon, but not forever long. So, increasingly modeling tells us that if we actually reduce emissions, we will see impacts faster than we used to think.
Yeah.
That said, yeah, adaptation really forces us to think in the here and now. Every time we have a climate impact in the Northwest, it's staring us in the face. Yeah, of course. Yeah, Caroline.
Thank you, Anne. Great talk. I was reminded of the old adage, necessity is the mother of invention. And I'm thinking a little bit about levels of scale and appropriate levels of scale for analysis as we begin to think and talk about climate change adaptation, particularly when we think about social networks in a core and a periphery. How do we parameterize community? You spoke a little bit about fine-grained longitudinal analyses that would account for individual level behaviors. What do you see as the priority scale? Is it the individual? Is it the household? Is it the community? If so, how do we define community? And how do we begin to operationalize that?
I love that. Another it's complicated question. So when I first started using the word community, this is actually an interesting thing. I kind of came to it from this social network assumption that community are individuals who spend a lot of time together. The thing is that works in disciplines like sociology and climatology, but oftentimes when we're having these big interdisciplinary conversations, we're thinking about community as the global community, or we're thinking about identity groups, or we're thinking about political communities, right? There's a lot of different ways to define it. And so I tend to think about it in terms of social networks just by default. I think about how people are managing risk, and a network perspective tends to work well for that. And so then we can ask questions about what is working for maybe the most people in the network, for example. But that then requires trade-offs, because that means that some folks might get supported where others are not getting all of their needs met. And that, I think, opens up, I'm just going to look at Michael here, says there's like all these kind of ethical questions about how we make those decisions as policymakers and as scholars, because even the assumptions we bake into the data we collect and what we think community is when we're writing research papers then impacts the policy recommendations we make. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer or not.
Yeah, it's a thought-provoking one.
Exactly, yeah, well, you thought provokes on my end as well, so thanks for that. Yeah. Perfect follow-up, Mike, go for it.
Actually, since I was trained as a philosopher of biology,
bringing that. Yes.
I really like the analogy to evolution and adaptation, and it seems like risk reducing instead of fitness enhancing, for example, is what you're aiming at here. But of course, in evolution, fitness enhancing, like long hair on a polar bear, is certainly fitness enhancing in the Arctic, but it's not fitness enhancing in the equatorial regions. And the reason I'm wondering about this is climate change has a variety of risks that go on, including risk to massive reshapings of economies, say like West Virginia. Their climate risk is a completely different risk, and it seems like what would be a good adaptation for them is to deny climate change as much as possible to keep their economy running. And at first I thought you might say, no, what's going on in denial in West Virginia is a candidate adaptation. But it does seem, if I squint, like it is reducing their risk that is a product of climate change. And I'm wondering how, if I'm screwing up the evolutionary analogy as you'd like to use it, or if there's a better way of understanding it.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I hadn't thought about West Virginia in that way before, so my wheels are already turning. Yeah, and this comes back to Caroline's question about adaptive for whom, right? So what is the community? Who is it benefiting? Are we thinking about what works for the United States or the world? Are we thinking about what works for West Virginians?
And on what time scale?
And on what time scale
Yeah.
do those benefits accrue? And so I think while I like to kind of actually nail my feet to the floor when it comes to what adaptation is, it then actually forces us to ask these really difficult questions about for whom. So in terms of managing risk, I think your point is well taken. I think most folks in the climate community would say that is maladaptive, because what ends up happening is that it works over the short term and over the long term it's not. The problem sometimes with adaptation in biology is that it's often backwards looking, where adaptation is the product of what happened in the past. It's not forward looking. It doesn't know what the future holds. Mm-hmm. And so then the question comes when we're thinking about climate change adaptation, it does need to be forward looking. That's where the analogy starts to get a little rocky, is that if we're thinking about adaptation, we have to be forward looking. How forward looking is West Virginia's strategy in terms of risk management? How long can that work? I think it's a difficult question. I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, it might also be things like how much of it is sticking for an analog of common ancestry, or perhaps a force of drift, like a force
I
of
see.
drift. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to sort that out in my head to make the analogy fit. I really like your analogy, and it gives me an easy area to sink in, but it's still,
What are
there's
the
a couple of
limitations?
details around the boundary that I'm still a little confused about.
Absolutely. So what I'll do, since we're talking now about forces of evolution like drift, I will spare you all those details unless you're into it, but if you want to stay after and chat with me, and Mike, if you have a couple minutes.
I won't be. We should do it at some point. I
We
owe
should
you
do
beer.
it at some point. You feel free to talk to me or come to dinner with Mike and I, and we will talk more about it. Yeah, go for it, please.
I'm curious how you define the relocation. Do you explain it as the failed adaptation or as the one of the ways to adapt?
What are the ways to, and the reallocation in terms of money?
Migration.
Oh, migration, thank you. That's a great question, because I run into that one a lot. So oftentimes migration is considered maladaptation, because it means that adaptation locally has not worked and people are now on the move. If you take this long perspective of what humans have been doing, migration actually can be quite adaptive. It's a risk management strategy. So it partially depends, though, on under what conditions people are migrating. Are they migrating as a strategy, where it's something that folks do, they're expecting, or is it a last resort move? If it's a last resort move, it still can reduce risk, but at the same time, it tells us exactly that, right? That the adaptations locally have not been working, that impacts are too great and people can't manage that risk locally, and that's why they're on the move. So I actually tend to say that mobility, at least historically for humans, has been adaptive. Whether or not it still is today, I think, depends partially on the context. Borders really complicate things in terms of folks moving away from climate impacts. Again, I really like to say it's complicated. Did I address your question, Lisa, a little bit? Thank you. Yeah, sure. Chris.
Anne, great talk.
Thank you.
And I could ask this later, but I'm curious if you thought about the sort of intersection with social inequities a bit more here, especially thinking about how you mentioned that peripheral communities are often the ones that are on the front line or innovating, but that also often means that they're quite literally marginalized, right?
Yes.
On various definitions, and so I'm wondering, have you thought about sort of the ethical implications of taking innovations from these peripheral communities and what our role is in that?
What our role is in that? So, it's a really good question. So we actually know from the anthropological and social network literatures that communities on the periphery are often able to innovate quite a bit. There's a lot of knowledge baked in there. I mentioned traditional, local, and ecological knowledges. Those are often there in peripheral communities, in marginalized communities, to actually make that and really put a point on it. And so the thing is that we run into that last point I made, right? Objects of study, right? We're looking at peripheral communities saying, that's so great what you've got out there. How do we actually kind of find a common ground and do community-led or community-engaged research with peripheral communities that supports innovation? So as an anthropologist, I think that involves a lot of conversation and a lot of kind of humility and coming to the table and saying, I'm not going to bring the answers here and assume that you don't already have ideas. And then actually having those conversations when those communities want the support. That's the other thing, right? I mean, we shouldn't assume that peripheral communities need the support unless they want it. Offering is one thing, but assuming is another. What's really interesting as well is there's been a movement from Indigenous and Native peoples coming to COP27 and COP28 saying, we want the money directly. No middlemen telling us how to spend it. We want the money. We know how to use it. And I think that's a really interesting call that we should be thinking hard about, right? How do we make that happen? I don't know if that answers your question.
I'd like to try something.
Sure, please.
Your local, building into it longitudinally, what kind of factors of scale of disaster?
Yeah.
I'm thinking in the Palouse, we've had a town burned to the ground, which is sort of the, and I suppose locally we can look at the Maui losing Lahaina, quite spectacular way. It's not a very tight community, but do you have some way of building in and actually looking at, is it adapted to have an example like Malden burned down, and have you studied it?
Oh, jeez. Is it adaptive? No, I would say it isn't. So have we studied those kinds of climate impacts? No, that's an interesting question. You know, Lahaina is an interesting example because what you see is that in the aftermath, people banded together. The entire island came together, and they offered support before we could even get federal support on the ground. And I think that tells us a lot about humans. We shouldn't be relying purely on those social networks because we strain them to the absolute max when we don't have support coming from government sources, for example, especially given the climate impacts we are facing, right? But I think there's a lesson to be learned there, also looking at that, is that those support networks come out in disasters, and they're interesting. How can we bolster those networks before disasters happen to enable communities to use systems of risk management they already have in place and just make those stronger and make sure they're well-resourced? That's my take on it. But I think that that's something that we often see kind of emerge is some strategies humans have that can actually be an indicator of human resilience. I don't know if that speaks to your question. Yeah.
I'd like to kind of go on with the fire example here.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So, you know, you have the example of Lahaina, but we have the example from Montana as well, where, you know, their governor basically just said the state is going to reinstitute a 10 a.m. policy where all fires are going to be suppressed immediately as soon as possible by the state. So you have kind of two disasters in different places, a really bad fire season, a really, you know, in Montana, a town burns down in Hawaii, but two very different responses. So I think from your talk, you know, your talk explained a lot of innovation and how we can address in a positive way risk management in the future. Can you speak a little bit to what causes a maladaptation in Montana where we get a regression in policy outcome or adaptation?
Yeah. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about today. I have an NIH grant due tomorrow that's focused on climate change adaptation in Southern and East Africa. It's a WSU collaboration, in fact. And one of the things that we see a lot in the literature on East and Southern Africa and looking at folks who are living in arid spaces and semi-arid spaces, it may not surprise you, but structural constraints are a huge issue, right? So, I mean, it's all well and good to talk about innovation, but if people aren't able to innovate because of government policies, if people aren't able to innovate because of inequities, so talking a lot about gender in that space as well, that means that then we can't see those good ideas emerge and spread and get used and tried out by communities on the front lines. And so I think, and again, I like that all this is coming out in the Q&A because we can really think about this as a group. How do we support, for example, innovation, transmission, connections between communities, resilient risk management networks that actually also take into account the fact that there are inequities baked in already that need to be addressed and structural constraints already baked in that we need to address, like what's going on in Montana, which I didn't know about, and that's good to, it's unfortunate, but good to know about. Can I answer your question? Follow up?
Can I just ask, so are there any
Yeah.
variables where you try to model these things out that lead to a prediction of whether the response will be innovative or aggressive?
In terms of the structural constraints, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so the one thing we do know is that innovation really can be stifled in those really big clusters we see in terms of social networks. We get a lot of conformity, and so people will actually kind of all go towards one idea. So if you have a really strong voice saying, here's what we're gonna do, everyone's like, okay. It's not that simple, but it tends to be more likely to happen in very large, tightly connected groups than small or peripheral communities, for example. And so that's one thing to kind of think about is what do the structures of those networks look like, because that can actually lead maladaptation to spread.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
We have time for one or two more questions if.
Yes, please.
To sort of piggyback off of that question, how do you factor or model power or hierarchy into these like social network models that you make, since they are so diverse and different, especially in different regions?
They so are. So this is where you'll learn that I'm learning on the job when it comes to social network analysis. So when it comes to thinking about how things move, let's take the example of adaptations to climate-sensitive diseases in Africa, which is that grant I'm working on right now, so I'm thinking a lot about it. you have to think about the links between these individuals. So for those of you familiar, we're talking about nodes and edges here, if you're thinking about social networks. So what is in those edges? We need to have both node property and edge properties. So nodes, for example, can have power differences. You can actually, when you're modeling this, give one node different power than the other by changing this kind of variables in your model. And then additionally, what you can do is you can change the directionality of that edge. So you can get, for example, one-way flows of information that reflect power structure, where one individual is doing all the talking and none of it listening. Does that help answer your question? Chris, yeah.
I thought if this is the final question, maybe it'd be interesting to tie it back to two previous points, where the analogy here is like innovations are sort of like mutations in genetic evolution.
That's right.
Do you expect here innovation? So we know that most mutations end up being deleterious. Do you expect here that same property for innovations, and if not, why?
So Chris is probably alluding to the larger field of cultural evolution, which some of these ideas are coming from. So it ends up, when it comes to cultural information for humans, we do a lot of innovating and talking and sharing ideas between brains. You just think about, this lecture is like idea sharing already. What's interesting about culture when it comes to humans, and using this analogy from biology when it comes to culture and how it changes, is that there's a lot of scaffolding. A lot of things that come from innovations, mutations as you're putting it, actually can work quite well, because first of all, there's not a long lag time. When something doesn't work, sometimes it goes right away. Misinformation is something we need to know more about in that space. And then additionally, we often see these kind of cumulative cultural traits where we're building on past ideas. When we're coming and pivoting on new ideas for adaptation, we can build on what's already there. We don't totally have to start from scratch. So do I think do I think that mutation is as likely to produce maladaptations in the cultural space when it comes to climate change adaptation as in the biological space when it comes to genes? I think not, but given how fast things are changing, quick environmental change isn't good news for biological adaptation. It means really new selective pressures. It's the same thing when it comes to cultural ideas. We need to be attuned to the fact that things that worked well before may not work well now, and thus the kind of focus on pivoting and modifying and focusing on supporting transmission as best we can. Does that help?
Okay, any more questions? If not, before we thank our speaker today, let me remind you our next event in this series will be next week, next Thursday, a week from today. Michael Goolsby, one of my colleagues at PCA, will be speaking about, he's an ethicist and teaches logic. He'll be talking about the logic of climate denialism. So I'll be following up on that. If you're here for the Common Reading Program, Karen's right up here. You can find her here. Now join me in thanking Anne Pisor for a great I know. Forever.